Hello, it's Kristen. Thanks for being here. Before we get started sketching from life, I wanted to show you some basic watercolor techniques and 3 types of watercolor washes. Okay, so I've got a paper with 3 rectangles drawn out. We're going to learn or practice 3 different types of washes. A flat wash, which is going to be the same color across the whole thing. A gradient wash, where it's going to go from dark to light. And wet and wet, which is going to be working with the paper wet in front of us. To start, I always like to mix up my colors, even if I'm just using colors straight from my palette. I like to dilute them and get them to the right saturation over here on the side of my palette. And that also kind of encourages you to do some mixing as well. So I've got this nice kind of bluey violet. Alright, so with a flat wash I want to make sure that I have enough pigment to cover the whole shape that I'm working on, so I want quite a bit over here. I don't have to remix it halfway through. Then I'm going to start on one side and work the wet edge across the whole rectangle. You can also kind of tilt the page, so that'll help the wet pigment run to the bottom of the shape. So I'm going to leave this part up here, or maybe I'll go over it one last time. And I'm just pulling the pigment across the shape. In this case, just a rectangle. Once this part up here starts to dry, I'm going to leave that alone. But you can see I'm working the wet edge. If there is a little bit of pigment left out, like pooling at the bottom here, you can pick that up and just whip it off. Once it's painted, you want to let it sit and dry. You can tell different pigments do different things. These ones are separating a little bit, which kind of creates a little bit of a texture on the paper, but that just happens sometimes. It's kind of cool, I think, when it happens. Okay, the next one we're going to do is a gradient wash, and that's going to be a similar process, but we're going to go from dark to light. So instead of continuing to refill our brush with pigment, we're just going to keep using more water as we go across so that it's less saturated. In watercolor, you use the white of the paper or water to get light values. Start out the same way I did the last one. But now instead of going back into my paint, I'm just going to wipe my brush off and dilute this so that it gets lighter. So this is a way to kind of keep a soft edge on your page. And you can also do this to transition from one color to the next. I'm just going back and smoothing this out a little bit, even though it was starting to dry. Okay. So this one goes to nothing, but you could have one where, say, you start with green, and then you're going to go to yellow, and you transition this part. I'm also going to just make some space for experimenting down here. So I'm just going to paint in some flat shapes. And some marks. So this is a good way for filling in space and getting flat shapes on the page, but you can also draw with your brush. This page is just for experimenting and trying things out. So wet and wet, you're gonna start with just your water brush and get this wet. You want it to be quite wet. So go over it a couple times, and you can even squeeze the brush a little bit to get it really wet. You can go in with your paint and just dab it around. See what happens. You can try drawing a line and watch it kind of diffuse. And put two different colors next to each other. See what happens. You don't have a ton of control with this technique, but it's a way to let the water and the pigment have more control, and you'll get some really fun surprises this way. So in watercolor, we tend to work in layers, working from light to dark. And once you have a wash that's dry, these are almost dry, you can come back and add another layer. And since it's transparent paint, they'll let the bottom layers show through. So you can say you have a leaf or something that you painted in here. You can come back on top and add some darker color to add a shadow. So I'll just do that. A lot of times with a shadow, you want to do a graded wash or gradient wash where you soften up the edges. You can also come back and add more texture or detail where it's dry. You can do that on top of places you've already painted. And yeah, use up the rest of the paper to experiment. You can go back over top of these ones, make different marks, see what your brush likes to do. Try making like a thick line or thin line. Make little dots. Yeah, play around and experiment.